To dye my yarn or fabric, I'm going to start out by adding 2.5 gallons of water, of warm water, to a bin. I need enough. This is a measurement for 1 pound of fiber or fabric. You want to have enough water that the material you're dyeing can move around the dye smoothly. I'm dyeing my yarn and fabric in medium shade today. And with the recipe that I have, I'm adding 3 cups of salt to the water. So before I start adding the dye, I'm adding the salt to the water so the salt can dissolve before I add the dye. So I'm mixing it up a little bit, making sure to wear gloves while I do this, and then I'll mix up my dye and add my fiber to water. I have my water with salt in it so the salt can dissolve. And if your salt is not dissolving, you can add some hot water or some boiling water to it. So to get started, I've made this little dye box that I'll use to dye. So the box is just the open part of a box. I put a piece of paper towel on the bottom. First I got it wet and wringed it out, so it's a damp piece of cloth. This will catch all the dye particles. So for safety, the first thing you need to think about when you're dyeing is you want to be outside. You don't want to dye in a kitchen space or anywhere where you're eating. These dye particles are very small and they can quickly become airborne. So the purpose of the paper towel inside of this box is to contain those dye particles so they don't float into the air, because that can cause a health hazard for you. You also want to make sure to wear gloves while you're working with dye. Your skin is the largest organ of your body and you need to protect it. So first I'm just shaking up my dye. I'll let it sit for a little bit. I want to make sure that all of those different colors of dye are mixed together. This is an orange that I'm using. I could mix up a yellow and a red to make an orange, but I have this orange, so I'm going to use it. So I'm making a medium shade, and instead of weighing the dye, because most people probably don't have a scale at home, we're just going to use a measuring tool. So I'm using teaspoons, and I need 5 teaspoons of dye for a medium shade. And if I were doing this not on video, I would have that paper towel right in front of me down further to really try to protect myself. You also want to wear a dust mask while you're doing this. So because my spoon has dye on it, I'll use it to mix up this dye. So I have my dye in my container, and I want to add just a tiny bit of hot water. And I start mixing that into my dye. I add a little more water. So you can see I'm slowly mixing up my dye to create a paste. So it's really important that you use utensils that you don't cook with. So these are only for dyeing. So I'll just scrape my dye down. So you can see there's this nice thick paste. And still I continue to slowly add hot water, a little bit at a time. And that was just a little bit more than I wanted to, but I'll make it work. The purpose of slowly adding to the dye and creating a paste before you turn it into a liquid is so that all the different colors of dye powder will dissolve, so you don't end up with speckled fabric. If it's not totally dissolved when you put it into the dye bath, then you can get speckles of color on your fabric. And you can swish your dye around to make sure there aren't little speckles of color stuck to the container. So again, all of my measuring tools I only use for dyeing. I don't use them for cooking. And all of my containers also, they're all just designated for dyeing. So now I'm ready. I've been soaking my fabric and my yarn in the water, and I'm ready now to dye it. So I have my yarn and fabric soaking in this water. It can move freely through the water, which is really important. And I'm just going to pull it over to one side and add the dye powder, dye liquid, into the bath. So you can see it's already starting to accept that liquid. And I'll leave it here for about 30 minutes before I add the soda ash. But in the meantime, I'm going to boil water and put the soda ash in the water so that it can dissolve. The soda ash is what fixes the dye. The salt helps the dye move through the water. So the soda ash is very important. And I will get that ready. Again, I want to wear a dust mask and use gloves when I'm working with the soda ash. With all of this, I need to wear gloves. And I'll let this sit. I'm going to move it every 5 to 10 minutes so that the dye can move through the fibers and evenly dye everything. I have my soda ash dissolved in water. It's a little bit orange because I used the same container that I mixed up my dye. Again, I'm going to move my fabric and yarn to one side as I pour my soda ash in. And now this needs to sit for 30 minutes to an hour, depending on how long how dark of a shade I'm working for. And then I need to rinse my fabric. I rinsed out my dye from my fabric and gave it a quick squeeze, the fabric and the yarn, as something to pay attention to as you're moving your fabric around. So every 5 to 10 minutes you want to agitate it, and you just want to make sure if it's folded, you open it up and the yarn gets agitated, but not too much because you don't want to tangle the yarn. So you can just pick it up and move it around, but you want it to still stay in order. So now that I rinsed it out, I put some clean water in, and you can see there's still dye in the water. So I'm going to use the Synthropol. It's a industrial strength soap to wash out your fabric, and it's designed to grab the dye molecules away from the fiber. I have Synthropol in this bottle, and you only want to put a couple drops into the water. So very small amount of Synthropol. It's a condensed soap, so you don't need a lot. So now I just agitate the water a little bit. You can see that there's dye in it, or you can see that there's Synthropol in it. And I've only put a few drops in. I'm going to let this sit in the water for about 30 minutes. And then I'll rinse the water out and do the same thing again. I'm not going to keep running water over and over again to wash the dye out, because the Synthropol will actually work to grab the dye molecules and pull them away from the fiber. So the next rinse, you'll see the water is going to be a lot lighter. So I rinsed this out twice until the water ran clear. I put the water in, put a couple drops of Synthropol, agitated it, left it alone for 30 minutes, rinsed it out, ran some clean water on it. There was still dye coming out, so I put water, enough water where the fabric and yarn could float around, put a couple drops of Synthropol, agitated it, and let it sit again for 30 minutes. And then when I rinsed it out the final time, the water ran clear. So the yarn, I'm just gonna wring out to really get some water out before I hang this yarn to dry. And I wanna find the areas, I can find that loop now that the yarn was tied into, and then I'll take the fabric and squeeze it also, and then open it up and hang it to dry.